Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and by other public television stations, and by the following.
We're in London outside the House of Commons, to which we have been invited in order to conduct two programs, one of them with Tony Benn, leader of the left opposition within the Labour Party, one with Sir Keith Josephs, Minister for Industry. The noise that you will hear during this program is noise not made by any participant of Firing Line, but the airplanes are friendly, so stay tuned. Thank you. There is a struggle going on in Great Britain for the control of the Labour Party, to be sure, but also for its soul. And the principal spokesman for the left wing of the party is Tony Benn, who is Secretary of the National Executive Committee of the Trades Union Congress. At Mr. Benn's request, the Executive Committee recently published a draft Labour manifesto for 1980, which it hopes to see approved at the Plenipotentiary Party Conference in October. The Economist has described this manifesto as, quote, basically a collation of Labour conference resolutions passed over the years, reheated to give them a redder tinge. It calls for everything from abolishing the House of Lords to abolishing fox hunting. It stops only just this side of abolishing the pursuit of profit. Tony Benn is embarrassed to recall, indeed he has recently removed his biography from Who's Who, but there is a black market for it, and besides, I debated with him at Yale University in 1948, when he toured America as president of the Oxford Union, preaching socialism. Tony Benn was born Anthony Wedgwood Benn, heir apparent to the title of Viscount Stansgate. To his great embarrassment, he was catapulted into the House of Lords when he fell heir to the title, and he began his pursuit of auto-proletarianization. It remains, however, a historical fact that he attended Winchester College and then New College in Oxford. He has served in the House of Commons almost without interruption since 1950. He has served as Minister of Power, Minister of Technology, Minister for Posts and Telecommunications, and as Secretary of State for Energy. He has also served as Chairman of the Fabian Society. He seeks now the leadership of the Labour Party, whose incumbent leader, James Callaghan, was defeated in June of 1979 by the Conservatives, led by Mrs. Thatcher. Our examiner today is Mr. Harold Evans of the Sunday Times, whom I will introduce in due course. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Benn kindly to outline the proposed reforms within the party before we move on to examine his manifesto.
Yeah, before I do that, the introduction is riddled with inaccuracies.
Oh, dear.
In all sorts of... I won't bother with them, but it's a typical media presentation, and it is inaccurate in a number, including the date when we debated, which was 1947 and not 1948, including the fact that my father was a Labour Member of Parliament and at the end of his life became a Lord, like a lot of Labour MPs. But still, that is the media image, and I guess you're paid to keep it going. But the reforms that we're trying to introduce are to bring the Labour Party into line with the policies that are the structures that are common in the United States and in most social democratic countries. That is to say that the leader of the party should be accountable to the whole party and not simply to the parliamentary faction. Secondly, that the policy of the party should be determined by the party and not by the leadership. And thirdly, that there should be a rough and ready primary system under which every candidate for the House of Commons would have to be available for a selection or reselection in each parliament. Now, these are very modest reforms, and it is a reflection, really, of the extent to which British politics is centralised in power, that alone among the progressive parties of the Western world we haven't got them. And I think those are the factors that ought to be taken into account. They're very modest, but they are necessary, because unless we can do that, then the party will be run by a leadership rather than by the membership. Those are the issues, really. Very simple.
Well, then, would it be safe to generalize that you seek to move in the American direction, in which the leader has a wider constituency than the members of his own
Yes, I
party?
think the feeling is, and I share it, it's not about who gets the job, because I don't think it would make much difference, frankly. But the idea that a party leader should be accountable to the party he leads and not just to Labour members of Parliament. Now, even if the whole conference elected the leader, which is one proposal, Jim Callaghan would have become leader in '76 because he had already been elected by the conference as treasurer of the Labour Party, which is a very high-ranking position, the only one elected by the whole conference. Hugh Gaitskell was treasurer of the Labour Party, elected by the whole conference. So it isn't a matter of who, it's a matter of whether, when a man is there, he is accountable to the whole party for what he does. And I think in all over the world, in Eastern Europe and in the Western world, power has become much too centralised, and there is a general desire to get it shared a bit more widely.
Well, if it has become too centralized, have you raised your voice to object to the singular dominance of the Trades Union Congress, whose members are now less than 300,000 over the Labour Party?
Well, there are 12 million trade unionists in Britain, of whom 6 million are in trade unions affiliated to the Labour Party. The trade union movement set up the Labour Party because they felt they could not rely upon the Conservative or Liberal parties to represent the interests of Labour. And therefore, if you go right back to 1903, when the Labour Representation Committee was set up, it was set up by the trade unions to give working people a voice in Parliament. And one of the amazing things to us looking at the United States is to find that the elections that are taking place in America in 1980 offer no real choice to the American people. You've got the various candidates in both parties all saying exactly the same thing. And it's this choice that the Labour Party offers. And the trade unions are, after all, many of them individual members of the Labour Party, and many Labour Party people are in their own trade unions. So it isn't dominated in that sense, but at the conference, the trade unions do have a very strong voice based upon their affiliated membership.
As it happens, and perhaps you will discover this when you travel to America next week, the candidates in America are not saying the right thing, but perhaps that's the image that you like to have, the perception that you have of American politics.
Well, I studied all the speeches made, and I read the platforms, and there's a difference of emphasis, but both of them basically believe in a market economy, believe that market forces will determine the level of employment, and as the United States plunges into the deepest slump since the 1930s, the absence even of an FDR voice based on a sort of Keynesian idea is very marked, and it's we get the impression, and I've visited the United States many times over 30-odd years, that this very narrow choice offered to the American people is almost unique, really, in, well, we have no precise experience of it.
Well, it may be that the American parties are benefiting from the experience in Great Britain, where you have a higher inflation rate than we do, and marginally higher unemployment rate. To be sure, we both share something less than the increase in the gross national product that is being currently enjoyed in France, Germany, and Japan, for perhaps much the same reasons. However, before we abandon completely the whole notion of political responsibility, what you have said is that you need a party that represents the interest of trades unions. You then mention the number of trades unions.
No, I didn't say trade unions. I said the interests of working people, because not everybody who works is in a trade union, and an awful lot of trade unionists vote Conservative.
That's right.
So that we're not arguing about direct representation of unions as unions. The Labour Party was set up to represent the interests of working people and their families, and that's what we aim to, those people we aim to represent. And that's the basis of the Labour Party.
Yes, but the basis of the Labour Party, as I understand it, is to give to the Trades Union Congress a control over the affairs of the Labour Party.
Bill,
that is rather distinctive, isn't it?
Let me stop you there.
Yeah.
You really got the thing wholly wrong, factually wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The Trade Union Congress is not affiliated to the Labour Party. Trade Union Congress has nothing whatever to do with the Labour Party. The Trade Union Congress, I'm sorry to have to take you back to basics, but it is a reflection of something that you shouldn't know because you're a skilled political commentator. The Trade Union Congress, which has been meeting in Brighton in early September, is made up of 12 or 13 million affiliated, well, of the unions representing 12 million workers in this country, and it has no connection with the Labour Party except there's a committee that talks between the Labour Party and the trade unions. The only element in the Labour Party that comes from the trade unions are those individual trade unions which are affiliated to the Labour Party, and that only represents one half of the unions at the TUC. I must put this right, because otherwise we'll be going on with a discussion that's quite meaningless.
Yes, but I hope you're not here to represent that the TUC does not, in fact, dominate the Labour Party.
The TUC has nothing whatsoever to do with the Labour Party.
I'm not talking about the formalism.
No, I mean, that if you say that there are trade unions who set up the Labour Party, that is correct. But that represents half the trade unions who go to the TUC, and there is no affiliation by the TUC to the Labour Party. It is important to get this right, because otherwise listeners and viewers watching this programme will get a wholly false impression. Now, the Labour Party is a trade union party, quite correct. Mm-hmm. And the affiliated unions, with their big affiliated membership, have a very powerful, overwhelming role in the votes at the Labour Party conference. But it has nothing to do with the TUC, and the TUC is made up of trade unions that are not affiliated to the Labour Party or have any particular affinity with it. So it's important to get that right.
Well, what the TUC comes out for is likely to translate into Labour Union policy.
Well,
isn't that correct?
Well, what is true is that if you get, as at the TUC Congress this year, you get a pretty steady view. For example, the TUC was opposed to British membership of the Common Market at its Congress. Mm-hmm. So was the Labour Party. And because very many of the same people attend the TUC Congress and the Labour Party conference, you get a similar presentation of view. But it is important to differentiate between the Trades Union Congress and the affiliated unions to the Labour Party. Very important, otherwise people are misled.
It's, I think, important to dwell on the extent to which it is probable that British politics are going to split. You have Roy Jenkins, for instance, announcing that he is attracted to a centrist party. You have Shirley Williams and William Rogers and David Owen repudiating your efforts to reform, as you would put it, procedures within the Labour Party. It is widely predicted that in the next few years there might be three parties, of which yours, or what's left of yours, would be a kind of a left split trades union party devoted to the sort of repristination of socialism. Is this a fair analysis of trends within British politics?
It's a presentation of what has been said about the Labour Party since the early days. We've never split, and I suppose more money has been earned by more journalists, and more recently more money has been earned by more television commentators predicting a split in the Labour Party than on any other single issue. It is the hope of the right in Britain that the Labour Party would split, and therefore they speak about it, hoping it will happen. But if you go back from, say, 1914 to date, because I dug the figures out the other day, 59 Labour members of Parliament who were elected as Labour have left the Labour Party in the course of their lives and joined the Tory Party, like one present Conservative minister, or have gone out into the wilderness of the Liberal Party. We've lost a Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. We've lost two foreign secretaries, Ramsay himself and George Brown. We've lost 39 ministers, including 11 cabinet ministers and 7 other senior ministers. We've lost a Lord Chancellor. And we've never split. The Labour Party will never split. And it won't split for the very reason we were talking about earlier, that it is held together by its commitment to seek to represent the interests of working people. And so that all these predictions about it splitting are wholly false. I'm not saying that one or two more people won't leave, because they do leave individually, one or two together. I would be sorry if anybody left the Labour Party. But if there were one prediction I would make with some confidence, it is that the Labour Party will not split. And it didn't even in 1931, when its leader and several senior ministers joined the Conservative Party. The Labour Party never split, and it won't again. I feel absolutely confident about that.
Well, you've made that as a prediction, and it may very well be an act of faith. In fact, something has happened to the Labour Party. In 1951, it had over 1 million dues-paying members.
Yeah.
Labour Weekly estimates it has 284,000 today. So there is some presumably popular sense of dissatisfaction with it. Now, it may not split, but it might disappear.
No, it won't.
Is that what you're saying?
No, it won't disappear. It had 800,000 members in 1964, and at the end of the Wilson government it had fallen to 400,000. And I think there is a sense of disappointment among a lot of Labour people that we say one thing in opposition and do something else in government. And the real reason, or one of the major reasons why we're going for party reform now, is to try and restore credibility and integrity to British politics. Because the Labour Party is a socialist party, it always has been, and its socialism has been somewhat renewed by the fact that it is now a country, and the United States and the Western world are slipping into slump. But the fall in membership occurred at a time the Labour Party was swinging sharply to the right. The biggest votes we've ever had is when we've had the most radical program, 45, 64 and 73. And I think that is established beyond any doubt. People actually vote Labour in the expectation that there will be a change in the structure of power in society. And I'm afraid they've been disappointed, because over the last 20 years, Labour Party leadership has been really a revisionist leadership. It's tried to bury its commitment to socialism, and I think that's a factor myself in the decline in our support.
Well, how do you account for the decline in the support of the more ideologized parties of the left, the Trotskyist parties, for instance, or the communist parties?
Well, it depends which country you're looking at. I mean, if you're looking at Italy, for example, where the Communist Party was the main opposition to Mussolini, it is a very big party. In Britain, we have no Communist Party.
It too has slipped, by the way.
But
it too has slipped.
Well, yes, but the difference in the strength of Communist parties depends on the history. If you've been in a fascist country and had that experience, then the representation of working interests has come in a different way. In Britain, we have a very small Communist Party, but it's been common, and this is what Fleet Street in Britain lives on, to belittle the role of the Labour Party and to say that it's going to split, it's going to die, it's an ideologized, to use the jargon, party. It is none of those things. It is a party representing the interests of an awful lot of people, and it's been in power for half the time since the war, and it is a party that has been beaten in the 1979 election. But it is a party which, during the course of the 1980s, will win an overwhelming majority again and will make some fundamental changes. And I know it's easy to write people off when they've been beaten. We were written off in 31 when we had only 50 MPs. In 35 we had 150. 1945 we had an overwhelming majority, and we will again.
Well, presumably some of these changes are brought about by objective events.
Yeah.
Sir Nicholas Henderson, in his valedictory as a Foreign Service officer, wrote a rather dramatic statement which he intended for private circulation, but it was leaked somewhere along the line. But, for instance, he pointed out that between 1954 and 1957, British productivity rose on a scale of 100 to 168, while in France it went from 100 to 266, Germany from 100 to 277. It seems to me that these objective circumstances are slowed slightly by the advent of North Sea oil, without which it would be very difficult to understand how you would be managing to float your pound.
Be serious. You're an observer of the political scene. Nicholas Henderson is a Tory. He's a Tory in the Foreign Office, and we've got lots of Tories in the Foreign Office. He was our ambassador, and he wrote a political address. Whether he hoped that it would get him a job from an incoming Thatcher government, I don't know. But let's try and discuss these problems seriously. You've got in America, 8 million unemployed. In the common market, there's 7.5, 8 million unemployed. Here in the United States and here in Britain, let's trade, quotations and a few odd statistics. We are in a very, very serious slump. In the pre-war years, that slump was only solved by rearmament. The New Deal in the United States, it was quite an interesting idea with the Tennessee Valley Authority and the WPA and all that, but it never solved the problem of unemployment. What brought America back to full employment, which realized the 60 million jobs objective, was rearmament, public expenditure. Public expenditure in building ships, Kaiser with his prefabricated Liberty ships and all that.
What brought rearmament to Japan and Germany?
It was rearmament that ended the slump in the capitalist world, and that was all public expenditure. People don't go into a shop and say, I want a Spitfire, I want a Hurricane, I want a Tomahawk fighter, I want a Liberty ship. The state buys it for them. And the challenge to people in the United States, where unemployment is having a dramatic effect in closing factories, throwing people on the dole, meaning the taxpayers paying them to do nothing. The challenge to our generation is how we can get unemployed people back to work to meet unmet need without war. Now let's cut all the crap, if I may be candid with you, about what happened to Labour Party membership and what Sir Nicholas Henderson said. What people watching this programme want to know, and what people want to know to me, when I go around the country where the unemployment is now 2 million and rising fast, is how can we get round the manifest absurdity of having men and women who want to work paid to do nothing when we've got poor housing, poor hospitals, we've got old people who need care, we've got kids who need to be looked after, and the money that there is, and there is tons of money, is going into speculation, in Krugerrands, in gold, in works of art. Now, those are the questions politics are about. It's not a university debate of the kind we had at Yale in October 1947. Let's get down. No, Bill, let me stop you.
Now, wait a minute. You've been talking non-stop for 5 minutes.
Well, I know, but all I'm asking is let's change the agenda from a sort of knockabout where you repeat every newspaper cutting you can find and I've got to answer it. Let's discuss what people want to know. How do we get full employment so that people's needs come in? Now, on that, we'll have an argument, because we won't agree about that. But I'm fed up, frankly, with the usual old media routine, and I hope it's not going to be like that for an hour, because it'll be an absolute waste of time.
Well, I think we can make more progress if we can agree that what you say is not automatically non-crap, and what I say is not automatically crap.
Well, I'm talking about an agenda.
All right, now,
I'm talking about an agenda.
You gave me your litany, which I first heard you give in 1947, about how only rearmament caused people to be reemployed.
That's true.
I cited Japan and Germany, which have very little unemployment, which did not rearm, which indeed...
In Germany before the war?
No, I'm talking about Germany since the war.
Oh, but I'm talking about how we solved the pre-war slump.
From what you were talking about in 1947.
No, I'm talking about how we solved the pre-war slump.
No, but I'm talking about the post-war slump. I'm talking about today.
Yeah.
Less than 1/2 of 1% of Japanese budget goes into armament, and they have an unemployment of less than 3%. Yeah. Under the socialist government here for 4 years, you had unemployment of 5 and 6%. Yes, under your Mr. Wilson, and subsequently under Mr. Callahan. And is this crap?
Well, I tell you, I think...
Are there falsified figures being issued by your...
No, I think you're fooling about on the margins, because I'm not talking about this swapping of statistics, which, as you know, can be produced to anything. What I'm talking about is a fundamental question, which cannot be denied, that in the interwar years, Hitler came to power because of 6 million unemployed in Germany, because there was no hope. It wasn't inflation, funnily enough, that brought fascism or Nazism to Germany. It was unemployment.
Why didn't it bring it to America?
Well, there was major unemployment, and in Germany they'd had the experience of war and all that. They swung to the right, and unemployment frightens people and swings them to the right. May take President Reagan into power because of fear. In the United States, and the circumstances were different there, Roosevelt, with a very cautious program, because as you recall, in 1932, he fought on a very cautious, fiscally responsible program. When he came to power, he tried to solve the problem by modest public expenditure programs and got hammered as being a socialist and all that. But actually, what brought life back to South Wales and the northeast in Britain, and brought life back to Scotland, and brought full employment in the United States, was a huge rearmament program. Now, in the post-war years, the Western countries, and we were one of them, we had not been destroyed in war. Germany and Japan had. We had a sort of rate of growth. But the world economy is back in slump. And the problem for us, and this is the only thing I'm interested in, I'm not interested in beating you in argument or beating anybody in argument, to turn our minds as to why it's happened and how you put it right. Now, there are broadly two views, or three if you like. The monetarist view is all due to strong trade unions and high public expenditure. Strip that back, cut public expenditure, and the economy will recover. That is absolutely false, because as you throw people out of work, you reduce demand. And every time you sack a man because you've closed a hospital or cut back public expenditure, he's not going to buy an automobile, so the auto worker is sacked, so he's then not going to be able to afford to buy a house, so the construction industry is clobbered. And we're in a position where the slump is deepening because I think the analysis of the Milton Friedman has got it wrong. Now, the alternative, of course, is to try and meet the gap by diverting the resources that are there to put the unemployed to work to meet our need. Now, that's what the real argument's about. It isn't about what happened under Mr. Callahan or Mr. Wilson. It's a really deep and interesting argument.
It's a deep and interesting argument that dates back to the early part of the 19th century when...
All goes back to Adam Smith.
Say...
Yes, Adam Smith.
When Say pronounced his law, and the question is whether or not demand generates its... whether or not supply generates its own demand. Now, the inflationists assume that merely by calling somebody, designating somebody as being employed, as they do in the Soviet Union, is going to cause real growth. What is the ultimately interesting question is not how many people are employed, but how many people are living a life that we would like them to lead.
That's not what you would like them to lead.
To be employed,
yes.
Earning as they do in China, less than $80 per year is not to lead the kind of a life that is economically exciting. So the question is, how does one achieve a maximum state of growth? And does one do that by expanding the public sector or not? We have only to look about us and compare the experience of Taiwan without a mainland China to see whether or not we want to be serious about pursuing the best interest, economic interests of the people.
Well, first of all, is it really for anybody, you or me, to decide how other people are to run their lives? I don't believe in that, and I don't believe in the alternative of state communism, because in state communism, which is developed in the Soviet Union, arising out of their circumstances, German invasion and so on, there's no political liberty. And it isn't just about the rate of growth. Life isn't just about the rate of growth. I mean, since we started worshipping Milton Friedman instead of the Sermon on the Mount, people think it's all about economic efficiency and return. Life isn't about that. People don't die for...
Your manifesto is substantially about that.
Not at all about that. Not at all. The Labour Party owes much more to the teachings of Jesus than it does to the writings of Marx, because the whole thing is about whether you have a society where you respect people's dignity and respect their right to live their own lives.
By nationalizing the major pharmaceuticals, for instance.
Well, if the major pharmaceutical industries screw the British public and get enormous profits out of the sick, and we say that since they are making their money out of the National Health Service, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't say
you need those profits in order to take care of the sick.
Well, you may or may not need the profits, but in the United States there's an enormous state sector, but it's defense. If you want to build aircraft or ships or go for a new generation of tanks, the American taxpayer pours the money into the defense sector. We put an awful lot of money into, well, let me finish, we put a lot of money into health.
Well,
and if people make a huge profit out of that at the expense of the sick, and we say that we think that money might be better channeled into meeting the needs of the sick instead of boosting the profits of the pharmaceutical company, there's nothing wrong in saying that. But that isn't really only what it's about. What it's about is how you give people good health. And in America, a lot of people still are terrified of ill health because it'll bankrupt them when they've sold their house, or they may have Blue Cross and all that. But at least in Britain, and this is a good example of socialism with all our problems, at least people have access to health on the basis of need for health and not on the basis of wealth. Now, that's really what it's about. It's not about profit and loss.
Talk about access, if you will. It takes 18 months to have a voluntary operation, a non-emergency operation in Great Britain as a result of the lack of access.
Well, let me give you an example. Yeah. My daughter-in-law, girl of 25, died of cancer last year. Tragic story. She had the best, the finest medical treatment, surgical treatment in the world. If she had been in the United States, it would have cost her, I would guess, $100,000. My son, who works as a research official in a trade union and is a local elected councillor, been bankrupted by that. Now, nobody's going to tell me that there aren't millions and millions of Americans watching this program today who yearn for a situation where they have the same access to health as we have in Britain. All right, we wait a bit for medical treatment.
Do you realize that 88% of the American people are insured?
Well, maybe they are, but don't I know, Bill, I know enough about the United States to know that the fear of ill health is one of the deepest fears among American working people. And nobody's going to persuade me that Blue Cross, with its limited cover, provides the security that we have in this country about health. It's the greatest thing. Now, in the United States, you've had socialized education for years. Don't give me this stuff about this is a sort of a move towards an Eastern European state. You have socialized education. Every child in the United States is allowed education, whether he's rich or poor, and a good education. Now, we've done in health what you've done in education. And that's what life is about. It's about giving children the right to be educated, giving the old dignity in retirement, giving people work when they want to do it, and giving people good health. And all this
Tony,
view of it as profit and loss is a very crude.
I'm obliged to tell you that you can't give anything to anybody without taking it from somebody else.
Oh, quite right, of course.
If the two of us are stranded per impossibile in a desert island, and you have the right to good health, I have the obligation to give it to you.
Oh, no,
if you have the obligation to be educated, I have the obligation to educate you, which, by the way, I would undertake to do.
I'm sure you would.
Free of charge.
But let me take you back to, you've got to earn it first. This is the socialist case, that the real wealth is created by the people who make the goods, and the profit is taken by the people who own the companies. Now, if you find, if the American example is too close to home, how do you think the United States, or Britain for that matter, reached its prosperity? It was getting, say, the oil from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran. For years, the American
oil discovered by American investment capital.
The American oil companies exploited the Iranian people. If that's why there's trouble with Iran now, the Americans, British first, British Petroleum, a nationalized company, nationalized by Churchill, nationalized the British Anglo-Persian Oil Company, exploited the Iranian people for years, took their oil at a knockdown price, wouldn't allow trade unions, wouldn't permit the development of political freedom in Iran. The money came back. British Petroleum made a hell of a lot of money out of that. Then in 51, after Mossadegh, the Americans come in. There's an American oil consortium, takes over in part from Anglo-Persian or BP. Then the CIA puts the Shah back on the throne to be sure that they can keep control of Iran, and the profits created out of the wealth of Iran goes into the pockets of the oil companies and the American taxpayer. And then people are surprised when there's a revolution in Iran. Now, look, there's a different analysis from the one that you
I
put
hope
out
so.
on this
That's
program.
a Charles Gardner versus analysis.
It's not a child. After all, the United States did it itself.
Are you talking about the democracy under Mossadegh when he suspended the parliament for one half of the time that
What
he
I'm
ruled as
saying-
prime minister?
what I'm
That
s-
was your idea of democracy?
What I'm saying is that the American and the British oil companies exploited the Iranian people and stole the oil at
They
a knockdown
discovered the
price.
oil, they developed it.
Oh,
and
rubbish.
it was as a result of those
No.
discovery and that development
No.
that Iran
But there were-
enjoys what standard of living
Yeah,
it
but
now
what
enjoys.
were the wages of the Iranian oil workers? You've probably been to Iran. I went there as an energy minister when the Shah was on the throne. I had a long talk to him and met the oil company people. The oil workers in Iran, absolutely poor wages. It was a corrupt regime. The Shah was corrupt.
And you're
the
suggesting that-
profits went to the oil companies. Now, I'm answering your question when you said, who creates the wealth? Of course I agree that those who want it have got to pay for it. But the money they earn at work is taken from them by those, in that case the oil companies, and then you say, you're poor though, you created the wealth, the oil companies are rich, and all they've done is to exploit. So there is a different view as to where the wealth comes
Yeah, there's
from.
an extremely different view on how it is that you help people who are poor. The American way is by making things cheap. We were perfectly
No, no,
prepared.
no.
We were
First thing
perfectly prepared to sell oil for $2 a barrel
Yeah.
until the cartel was formed, of which you are now, though not actually a member, rather grateful for the rise in the price of oil.
But I'd like to know why they got
Never
poor
mind that it's
first.
costing
Yes.
all the people of Great Britain that much more money
Yeah,
to
but why
pay
are
for that
people
oil.
poor in the first place, Bill? You've got to ask yourself the question, why do the people who create the wealth end up poor and the people who own the land end up rich? Now, that is the basic socialist argument.
Why, by current standards, were 90% of the American people poor in 1900, whereas only 9% of them are poor today?
Well, I suppose
Because there has been a universal increase as the result of a gross national product, which has been made possible as a result of the economic exertions of free men, not men dictated to by the government.
There's circumstances that you had your frontier to develop. You had an awful lot of natural resources that others didn't have. But don't oversimplify it by saying that the American system is to be kind to the poor, because frankly, this analysis, if only the poor were patient and the rich were kind, all our problems would be solved.
No, it has nothing to do
Simply
with
doesn't
kindness.
fit.
It
doesn't fit the
has nothing to do with
explanations
kindness.
of my experience.
It has to do with you mentioned pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
The cost in our unnationalized pharmaceutical industry of penicillin went down by a factor of 1,000 to 1 in the course of 3 years.
Yeah, but then, I mean, if you want to take individual examples, the British mining industry, which is nationalised, can produce a ton of coal for £20 a tonne. In Germany, where the pits are privately owned, it's £38 a tonne. In Belgium and France, where the pits are privately owned, it's £53 a tonne. What does that prove? Proves that the nationalised pits...
That you're subsidising it.
No, no, quite the opposite. The cost is half those, a real cost of the German privately owned pit, and the Germans put £3 billion sterling a year in subsidising their pits in order to compete with the British pits, so that it depends where the investment goes in, and high productivity is a product usually of high investment. If the investment doesn't take place, the productivity falls. The British car worker now has got about half the horsepower behind him of the German and Japanese car worker. Why? Because the people who owned the British motor industry declined to invest. They put their profits abroad.
They declined to invest because they have to deal with a congeries of labor unions that make management almost impossible.
Well, I think that's false, because if you take the profits made by Ford, they're made in Britain, where there are strong unions, and when the profits are made, they send them abroad where trade unions are illegal, where they can exploit workers. Then they can produce cars cheaper, bring them in to undercut the living standards of British workers. And the American workers know this is happening in the United States. Profits made by American workers are exported to Taiwan, where the trade unions are illegal, where health and safety at work is poorer. Goods are produced in Taiwan with profits made by American workers brought back into the United States, and American workers are on the dole. Now, that's a basic
well, to the extent that we are exporting, wealth, we are delighted that
Say we.
Well,
What do you speak for, Bill?
I think for most Americans are saying that we are delighted that Taiwan, as a result of economic freedom, is earning at a rate of 600% what is earned by their cousins across the straits.
At whose cost?
It is
I
not
mean, at the cost of the living standards of the time. First of all, it's a client state, Taiwan has been. It would collapse tomorrow without American
But that
military
isn't
support.
true.
Oh, yes, it is.
No, we haven't sent them anything that they haven't paid for since 1962, Tony.
Well,
62.
I know there's been a slight withdrawal,
A slight withdrawal, like a
from
total
Taiwan.
withdrawal. They have paid for everything since
But why
62.
don't you support Taiwanese independence from China? Taiwan wants to be independent
We
from
would
China.
if they
No, but you're
asserted
supporting,
it.
No, you're supporting a refugee Chinese general's regime who occupied Taiwan, and you support it, and it's very useful to the United States.
Well, we and you recognize them up until 1959, and then you went in one direction, accomplished, in my judgment, nothing. We went in another direction.
Well, I don't
but let's
know.
leave that and
The
go to
question is,
Mr.
what is this doing to the living standards of American workers when the profits they make as a result of producing wealth in the United States are exported abroad to places where the working class standards are lower, to produce goods, to import into America, to raise unemployment in America? Now, what good does that do anybody?
If an American can get someone in Taiwan or in Great Britain to work for him for less than an American will work for him, why should he be deprived of that right to consult the marketplace for the best?
Now, this is the key question. How does he get somebody to work for him at lower
By
rate?
buying cheaper products.
No, he doesn't. By the American government propping up a corrupt anti-communist regime, supplying the dictator with arms, and he uses the arms to shoot the trade unionists who try... Well, that is true. What do you think happened in Chile?
That's the most...
What do you think happened in
utter
Chile?
hobgoblinization. I've told you three times that we haven't sent anything to Taiwan since 1962. We've only sold them defensive weaponry. So can we drop that?
No, we can't, because it's true, Bill, and it's uncomfortable, and I say it because we did it in the old British Empire. How do you think we succeeded in the 19th century? Was it Adam Smith was brilliant? Not at all. We occupied our markets with redcoats. You'd slung them out in 1776. We occupied India. We occupied huge chunks of the world. And when British troops were there, they obligingly bought the people, British goods, and sold us cheap raw materials. And the United States has got a world trading pattern which very strongly depends, I don't say entirely, obviously, strongly depends on the United States taxpayer giving arms to military regimes on the understanding that they're anti-communist, and the military regimes use the weapons to repress, look at Latin America, to repress the living standards so that trade unions can't organize, so that people can produce at cheaper rates than American workers in the United States.
I think you would be glad to learn, A, that it is not so, and
Well,
B, that the empire was
Brazil
the net economic drain on Great Britain during the 19th century. But Mr. Harold Evans, as our examiner, is the editor of the Sunday Times, an author of 8 books, including a book about skiing, and a graduate of Durham and the University of Chicago, Mr. Evans.
Well, I've been fascinated by the discussion. You've allowed Tony to parade some of the phantasmagoria of the left, and he's corrected you quite rightly on a number of occasions. I mean, you were completely wrong to say the TUC dominated the Labour Party, but by the same token you allowed Tony to get away with not discussing the block vote of the trade unions, by which a minority of active trade union members in the country decide policy. There's a lot of issues here, and if I were scoring it as a debate, I don't know how I'd award it. I found it fascinating. But out of both of your conversations, when Tony Benn trailed the problem of unemployment, quite rightly as the large central international problem, he wouldn't discuss present day and went back to rearmament in the 30s, but neither of you discussed the international implications and aspects of this. I mean, Tony, you say you're a socialist, but you never talk internationally. What is your answer to the oil price explosion, which has deflated demand and increased prices? You talk about a siege economy, import controls. You seem to have no feeling for the third world or for the oil price explosion.
Harold, you haven't listened to the argument.
Well, I have listened to the idea of paranoid nonsense.
No, you haven't listened to the argument. As a matter of fact, the OPEC price increase, which came along, struck a weakened Western economy. I mean, the problem was there before 1973, and of course much of the money which came out of the OPEC price increases went back to the countries who should have had it, went to the wrong people in those countries in many cases, the sheikhs and the Shah, but it went to the countries that should have had it. But the oil price in real terms, with inflation, hasn't been quite as big an increase as might appear.
Well,
now,
sixfold increase.
Thing is, Pardon?
A six-fold increase.
Yes, but it has been a substantial increase. It's been a wage claim on behalf of the oil-producing countries against people who have
how do you
in
cope
the
with
West. Well, now, half a minute. Let me say this. The oil price in the West is made up partly of the OPEC price and partly of taxation. Now, when I was the energy minister and I went round the world, many of these oil producers used to say to me this: you complain about the price we charge for oil, yet when our oil reaches you, you tax it, you put more money on top, you try and cream off profits for the American or the British taxpayer out of oil, and then you say we're overcharging you. It's a very complex argument, but I would entirely dispute the idea that what we are doing is contrary to the interests of the third world, because what we are arguing is that it is plain crazy that when the third world is crying out for equipment to lift them above the subsistence level, the bankers, Milton Friedman, the Sunday Times, should be urging us to have a policy that leads to high unemployment in America, high unemployment in Britain, and that's what you're arguing.
No, you argue for controlling the imports from these countries so that they don't have jobs in Taiwan and places.
Not at all.
You do.
No, to raise...
You are in favour of import controls,
wrong.
are you not?
You haven't listened to the argument. What we're saying is we have got to get back to full employment.
Are you in favour of free trade, total free trade?
I'm certainly not in favour of allowing market forces to determine the level of employment in the world. And I might add, the United States doesn't have free trade, Germany doesn't have free trade, Japan has never had free trade. What I'm saying is the main problem for the world today, as the Brandt Commission report brought out, the grinding poverty in the third world, and the most productive areas of the world, Europe, Japan and America, forced by their bankers and editors like yourself to adopt policies that throw millions and millions of people out of work. Well, you're in favour of unemployment as a product of monetary policy.
Of course, that's total nonsense.
Of course you are, and that's what the
I'm not
government's
allowing
about.
you to turn the debate to me because you know full well I'm not a monetarist. The point is, let me just ask you...
support a monetarist government.
Talking about unemployment, which you rightly raised as the major issue, I think that was the most interesting and important part. And this canard about America was saved by rearmament, we needn't go into that. Today, the lowest unemployment, Japan and Germany, they operate by methods of free enterprise, by and large, and free trade, which you deplore.
Well, you
Why
must
do you
be
think... No,
it isn't true.
Well, explain to me, how do you tackle the problem of unemployment?
Well, first of all, Japan is a highly centralized economy. MITI, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, was set up during the war by the Emperor to fight the war against the United States. MITI stayed in power as a major influence. The banks and the Japanese government plan their investment, they control imports.
But I thought you
try and import. No, but just a minute. Don't give me, please, the argument that Japan works on Milton Friedman's principles. It
I'm not
does
talking about Milton Friedman.
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't.
As a matter of fact, it does.
No, it doesn't, Bill. It does not. You try and import stuff into Japan, and you come up against a mass of... I'm not complaining if the Japanese maintain full employment by a sort of feudalism and capitalism combined. That's up to them. That's their problem. What I'm saying, and look at Germany. The Germans put £3 billion a year into their mining industry. So subsidized German coal, coking coal, goes into German steel, which comes into this country as subsidized German cars, which knock out the British steel industry, the British mining industry, and put us in a level. Don't please tell me that free trade is the policy of the world.
I'm not. What I was saying, I mean, you can point to aspects of centralization in Japan and in Germany.
And in America.
But by and large, they operate on market economies, which you oppose and criticise, and yet they are the most successful of the industrial democracies.
Well, are they? I'm not so sure about that. I remember Elliot Richardson, the American ambassador, came to see me once to complain that I had a scheme that made it a little bit easier for British firms to provide equipment for the North Sea. It was an interest relief scheme introduced by Ted Heath. It allowed a 1 or 2% lower rate of interest, and the American ambassador turned up and handed me a note. It was quite an event. But in the United States, under the Jones Act, if we produced a ship in Clydeside, half the price of American ships would be illegal to be operated off the United States. America grew on protection. How do you think America came to its part to the frontier and partly protection?
I would say that
we did it by the empire. And all this idea that it was all due to market forces.
Tony, wait a minute. We were protectionists.
Of course you were.
But it inhibited our growth.
Oh, I don't
To the extent that we grew to the extent that we had protectionism, we grew less fast than we would otherwise have
Don't
done.
believe that.
Even as the repeal of the Corn Laws helped you grow faster than you were growing up
Well,
to
I
that
think
point.
it was our empire and your protection and your frontier. But the problem, anyway, a historical argument you have for interest. But the fact is, and nobody can deny it, that there are billions and billions of people unemployed who could be producing goods for the Third World and who could be assisting the Third World to raise their living standards. And it's, I don't blame Mrs. Thatcher or anybody. I think it's a fundamentally old-fashioned economic system. And it'll go in the end. It may take us another 50 years, but it won't survive because it doesn't meet the needs of people.
Is there not a contrast, Bill Buckley? Would you, both of you, agree? Tony Benn talks about the need for centralised direction of economies.
I didn't say that.
Well, you did. I mean, you...
I did not say that. Never
I'm
once.
sorry. Well, that was the note I made, because it seems to contrast. Your political philosophy is decentralisation, and your economic philosophy is high taxation, centralised direction, subsidies,
No, I didn't say
and
any of
tariff
that.
protection.
I said what we've got to do is to get public investment in. You can get investment in a million ways. If you put money into hospitals or giving people higher pensions so they don't find it hard, or higher bed, that's decentralisation.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Bill Buckley, perhaps you'd help us on this. Tony Benn talked about the Labour Party changes he would like to see as representing a rough-and-ready primary system. Now, as I understand in the United States, in many states there's an open primary. Anybody can go along and decide who the candidate is. Is it not correct that in the system that Tony Benn is advocating in Britain, the constituency parties in many cases represent no more than 30, 40, 100 people deciding? Would you be in favour of open primaries in the way I understand the United States?
I'm in favour of people who
You
join.
talk about democracy. Why not open primaries?
Well, I'm in favour of people who join a political party having some say in who their member of parliament is and, as far as possible, in who their leadership are. But I don't think that it's the obligation of any political party to throw itself open to people who are not members of it.
All right.
And I don't think that makes any sense. I mean, I might argue that everybody who works for a company should be able to attend a shareholders' meeting.
Right.
But capitalist democracy is based on the fact that if you own shares, you vote at the annual meeting. And I say if you join a political party, you should have some say on how the political party is run. And every member of the Labour Party can attend the ward meetings, and so it is in that sense, it's an open system.
So you're not in favour of the open primary system? You
Well,
want
not in
to keep
favour
it
of
closed.
people who aren't members of the Labour
All
Party
right.
deciding what
So,
our
but I'm just
policy is.
wondering how democratic we're going to be. You see, this is what I'm trying to get. Let me just ask you another question. In the block vote, which you missed by this TUC obsession of yours, in individual trade unions, Transport and General Workers Union, 2 million votes will be cast at the Labour Party conference. By Tony Benn's own admission, probably half of them vote Tory.
Well, I'm a member of the Transport and
how
General Workers
democratic is that?
That's pretty democratic.
That 2 million votes are really decided by a handful of 20 or 30 men who don't consult the 2 million workers in the trade union before they decide on a multitude of issues. That's not democratic.
Let me give you two answers to that, Harold. First of all, I'm a member of the Transport and General Workers Union myself. And therefore, when Moss Evans, who is the General Secretary, goes to the conference, he is tied in the speeches that he makes by the annual conference of the Transport and General Workers Union. Now, they have their regional conferences, their local branches, and the democracy of the trade union movement, all I could say, is a great deal more democratic than the capitalist economy, where, as you know, most of the shareholders in Britain, and it may be true in America, are institutional shareholders, pension funds, insurance funds. I've got an insurance policy, which I took out when I got married. I don't know where the money is. I don't know who votes the shares. All I know is that somebody, somewhere, is taking the money I've paid every month for my insurance policy and using it for company decisions. I know nothing about it.
Well, in America, we can change insurance policies. I don't know whether you can.
Well,
here.
maybe I can, but as a matter of fact, I want a pension or whatever it is when I retire, and therefore I'm not actually in any way interested in how the money is spent. But all I'm saying is that in the labour movement, there is a specific democratic structure. Now, take the IMF, who came along in 1976 under the pressure of the American government and said we got to cut $4 billion off our public expenditure. Who elected the IMF? Who said that was what they were to say to Britain? Who told them? Where did they have their annual conference? What block votes has the Chase Manhattan Bank got who could help to push for cuts? The truth is the Labour
Well, we
movement...
wanted their money, didn't we?
That's right.
Oh, no, we didn't want their money. We did not want their money.
Whose money did you want?
Not at
Whose
all.
money did you want?
Not at all. They came and said, unless you cut public... You wrote a pamphlet about it called The Day the Pound Nearly Died. Now, Harold, you know very well, In that pamphlet, you reported in detail, Mr. Yeo, I think his name was, the one said public expenditure in Britain is too high, we're going to force them to cut it. And the power of the bankers in Britain, who are not elected by anybody, is 100 times greater than the power of the Transport and General Workers Union.
Yes, but we
now,
want...
come off it,
well,
be
no,
a bit fair.
We wanted IMF money, as you well know.
Didn't. No, we didn't. They said if you don't cut your public expenditure, we will cut the value of your currency. And as a matter of fact, the problem today, as you know very well, and you've written it in the Sunday Times, is that the pound is so strong that it's creating unemployment in Britain. Now, you've got to connect this recent history together.
No, but I'm really not convinced that the present reforms are to increase democracy. I mean, I have trade unionists in my factory who say they don't agree with half the things that are going on, and you well know this. And it's a very difficult problem how I mean, I would say to you, Bill Buckley, your open and closed primaries are more free than ours and more represent liberty, but on the other hand, so much money is needed in the United States to run elections, and I hope we don't get to that extent. Well, you need $5 million to run to be a senator or something like that, you see.
Yes, a total of something like $200 million a year is spent on presidential years. That comes to something like 2-3% of what is spent on advertising. I don't think it's an egregious cost when you consider that the mechanics of government and the policies of government are supposed to be established by that process.
But you have to be a billionaire in America to run as president, don't you? When did you last have a candidate who wasn't really a very rich
McGovern?
man? Well, didn't do very well.
Now, wait a minute. Now you keep shifting your ground. You said he ran for government. He ran and he won the nomination.
Yeah, he did. That's true. Yes. But it is true, isn't it, Bill? Also,
and since then, Carter.
Enormous sums.
Carter is not a millionaire.
Well, I suppose you fairly put a lot of money into it. But isn't it broadly true that in the United States, where you have the primary system, enormous sums are spent by business corporations in
those two are not necessarily connected. I'm not suggesting the primary system and money are connected necessarily.
In the first place, up until very recently, businesses weren't permitted to give any money, Tony.
Didn't they find ways of doing it?
No, they didn't.
Don't you think there are big business candidates in America? I thought there were. And who votes that a business can?
Well, there was a big business candidate who spent $9 million and ended up with one delegate. His name is John Connolly. So the notion widespread in Great Britain and other places not as informed as they ought to be about America is all you have to do is have a lot of money, you can become president. Ask poor Rockefeller or Averell Harriman, who spent all their lives trying to be president.
But it is also true, isn't it, that he talks about the bloc vote.
It's always useful. It's always useful to have money.
In the Labour Party, but it's also true that the way that capital supports the Republicans and maybe the Democrats of the Tory Party here is by pouring millions of pounds into political expenditure. And when I go and buy a bar of soap, or if my pension fund is invested in a company, I'm never consulted about whether the company is entitled to. Well, they never ask me, do I support the company in supporting the Tory Party?
But you can buy a different bar of soap.
Well, but I can't ask every time I try and buy.
I'll give you a list of all soaps you can buy.
Bill, that's ridiculous.
No, there's a lot of soft soap around here.
The Republican Party. We have 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Go ahead.
No. The real debate is between liberty and equality, and in the end, I'm not so sure how libertarian you are. That's my basic
The debate is whether we're stuck with Milton Friedman or Joe Stalin. And most people in the world don't want to be run by market forces or communism.
Milton Friedman allows us to run ourselves. Thank you,
liberty.
Mr. Tony Benn. Thank you, Mr. Harold Evans.
Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and by other public television stations, and by the following. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery. This program was produced by Sika, which is solely responsible for its content.